Happy MLK Day, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed their MLK Day, recognizing that today is definitely a day on and not a day off. Ubuntu Research and Evaluation had the opportunity to spend our day at Milwaukee Public Library, engaged in a lot of awesome activities, so many organizations represented, a plethora of young people. It was so exciting to see young people really engage in some of the practices of thinking about Martin Luther King and beloved community, and just a wonderful day. MLK Day, I always tell people, is like a New Year's do-over for Black folks. Like, let's treat this day as our opportunity to really make some resolutions around what does it mean to think about peace and justice and resistance in our time. Not to say that we just have to be like Dr. King or to let it land on his dream, but to think about what does it mean for us to be committed to the work and legacy that Dr. King has left for us. So many awesome things for us to think about on this day. Today, we really focused on beloved community. But I just wanted to, make sure that we pay homage and respect to Dr. King's legacy, because his legacy has everything to do with the choosing of this very first book for our book study. In case you haven't read or are unaware, today we should be talking about chapters 1 through 3. You might read this or listen to this video and be like, okay, now I'll go back and read. Or you might focus a little bit and reflect on some of your reading. So I'm just going to give a quick overview and then a very small homework assignment. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 really give you this overview of why the African American immersion schools were created. So you have this task force in 1989 that's really wanting to look at an issue that persists today. So we're thinking about it's 2019. This was 1989. 30 years later, the same issue that the board of school directors was looking at, the achievement gap between Black students, particularly Black males, and the rest of the district. So at the time, the composition of the district was different. So right now, Milwaukee Public Schools, you're thinking about more than 3/4 of the students are Black, but you're thinking about at that time that not being the case. And so the disparity became even more stark because you had a smaller number of students, but that means of their proportion, more of them were falling into this category. So there's a lot of transition over the last 30 years, but I think it's important for us to note that we're still talking about the same issue, right? Arguably, the school board directors at that time really created a proactive issue. The African American Male Task Force was a combination of community leaders and educators that were really dedicated to trying to find an active solution for addressing the disparities between Black males and their peers, right? So you had some very stark disparities in graduation rates and in literacy rates. There's nothing different right now. Arguably, in a lot of predominantly white institutions that some of the MPS elementary and middle schools feed into. In high school, you start seeing some of the trends also being true for Black girls. In some of the same ways, and definitely when you get to higher education, particularly public higher education in the state, you see the same trends being true for Black males and for white girls. So there's a lot of information that circles around that. Big picture is just an example of we can't deal with the impact of racism because people aren't really dealing with what racism does and how it behaves. One of the impacts is some of the disparities that we see within the public education system. But how can we deal with them if we're dealing with a system in which not everybody is really prepared to talk about racism or understand how racism is working? And particularly leaving it on people of color, especially Black folks, to then be responsible for dealing with racism when racism and how it's working is definitely an issue in which white people need to take front and lead in dealing with. Only makes sense for us to acknowledge that on Dr. King Day too. And so there's also segregation in schools. So you're thinking about, at this time, we had some of the busing situations had already occurred, and you had students being bused to different schools to really work on integrating the space. And they're about 20 years into fully implementing that plan and how it looks at MPS. And so some of the results were actually coming out and then showing how resegregation played out. As we know, housing has a lot to do with schools and people's proximity to schools. So white flight and segregation and redlining are really important issues to be mindful in Milwaukee's history, particularly how it ended up shaping Milwaukee public schools to be what it was in 1989, and definitely how it shapes up in 2019. So they talk a little bit about that and how that worked. So you had this task force that really said, well, what can we do to better accommodate these students and help push things forward? And so they advocated originally for an all-black male school. It was supposed to be black male academies. It was unheard of from a publicly funded source, something that they couldn't fathom that actually existing. There was a lot of pushback from that. Milwaukee and Detroit were at the front of really advocating for these spaces for black males. You have Detroit actually still having one of their schools too, Frederick Douglass Academy, dedicated to this idea and really working adamantly to make sure that black males had an educational space that was affirming to them. So because it was deemed that was unconstitutional to have an isolated gender school, it was agreed upon that this could be an African-American immersion school where culture and history of African-American students was seen as a priority and really used to nurture the space. And of course, if you read in the book, that meant two schools. There was an elementary school, which was with Dr. Martin Luther King, and a middle school, which was Malcolm X, which I think is so fascinating that you're thinking about the elevation of your learning going from MLK to Malcolm X. But, that's that's not how it played out. You have Dr. King that's really targeting this younger age group, originally meant to be a K through 5. Before it became Dr. King, it was Victor Berger. Having a neighborhood presence and definitely being one of the schools that was participating in this sort of integration busing thing. So you had this school being built with a principal who had been at the school previously, right? Which was a little different when they ended up building Malcolm X, because it was like kind of creating this middle school phenomenon. This issue kind of gets caught in the crosshairs of two different things, because middle schools being a thing was also a product of this time. People still don't even know, like, what's a middle school? Does a middle school work? Should we care about a middle school? Are we really doing middle school? So middle schools were still sort of experimental. I haven't done as much research on understanding middle schools. I understand schools, which a lot of us do. We understand schools based upon our educational experience. And I went through a K through 8, but 6th, 7th, and 8th grade was known to me as middle school, though I knew in some of the suburban school districts in which we integrated with, like in terms of like sports or something like that, that they had junior highs, or they had schools in which there were 7, 8, 9. So we were aware about some of those differences, but as a young person, that didn't mean a whole lot to me. It's only now as an educator really beginning to understand middle school experimentation and what does that look like. And so just a little bit to catch up, those of you who don't know, who are part of this group. Dr. King, that original school, is still in existence today. It's in the same building, has some of the same beautiful artwork on the outside of the school. A lot of things have changed within the building. And we'll get a little bit more into sort of how MLK's history over the last 30 years has been. But this sort of learning that we are doing is really, it's made for the school and the educators and the parents and the community members who are really invested in that school. If you are interested in learning more about the school or coming to visit or volunteering at the school, please let Ubuntu know, because we'll be happy to organize that for you. There's so many awesome things for you to get involved in that school. And just a plug for National Black Lives Matters in Schools Week, Monday, February 4th, there's a panel discussion led by the MTEA Black Caucus that you are welcome to come and join us to. We would love to see you there. I'll be on the panel, and a shout out to the leader of that caucus, Angela Harris. So just to let you know if you're interested in that. But some of the things that became really important in these first 3 chapters, I just want to highlight 3 things. 1 is principles, 2 is understanding teachers, and 3 was this whole validation of this African American immersive space and kind of what that was supposed to mean for the district. So the African American immersion school was supposed to, like the other one, I don't know if anybody knows, if you're familiar with this, MPS already had a culture around immersion schools. So we have, there's French immersion, Spanish immersion, German immersion. Now there's a Hmong school, and there's another immersion school experience. So the idea of immersive experiences isn't foreign to the public schools. And so this particular way of thinking about Black students getting an immersive experience was really thinking about language, history, and culture, right? And so the original charter, right, because there was a charter / MOU focused on grooming teachers to be better in terms of a cultural, historical, and even language-wise validating students who they are. And some of the pictures from them, which is part of our homework assignment, but some of the pictures from that time are really, really awesome. If you see the kids and they're drumming and wearing their kente and all of that. And so that's kind of like, there was an MOU. We were getting the teachers to either take credits. They had to take credits at a local university that were related to African American studies, or they were agreed to enroll in that. So there was this tangible commitment by the district. Again, remember the 30-year difference about what the difference is between public education and teacher professional development versus what it is now versus what it was then. But thinking about that, they were to take 15 credits or sign up or agree to be a part of that. There was in-house PD. There was a dedicated line to say, like, how can we make sure that Swahili language learning is a part of what's happening here? And the cultural experience was tying a lot of community resources and community organizations to the building. So the leader of that building definitely had a lot on their hands in thinking about that transition, making sure that people were aware of utilizing resources in that way, and that you got people in this continuous learning experience, validating African history of culture as something necessary to know in order to properly teach these children, right? So you already had that kind of in place and solidified by this MOU with the district that made sure to support that beyond just rhetoric, right? And so you have this book, which is kind of an evaluation of the project, and they're kind of outlining in these first chapters kind of like what's important, right? And the one thing that they mentioned, which I think is important because the principal was there before the school changed over and continued to be there after, so I think that was important. But they outright say that the principal is key. The principal is key. And you know, the research continues to show that how important principals are in school turnaround efforts, in raising achievement, and all of the things that really matter in terms of people's understanding of successful academic experiences, how important the principal is. And so there's 5 things that they outlined of what was important about this principal's work. And I'm just going to talk through them a little bit, which really connects to like a lot of knowledge on leadership and affirms everything that we understand about principal leadership at this point. So 1 was vision. Being able to articulate what the principal saw as important of where these students were trying to go, and where the school building was trying to go. The principal made sure that that was articulated, made sure that people knew it, and then spent some time really trying to get people to not just buy in, but to own that vision for themselves. 2nd was management, thinking about how a school leader, a building leader can utilize resources in the most effective way to meet the goals of their vision, right? So I did a lot personally. My whole master's degree was about resource allocation in school districts. And as I study that, it's not merely about where we put these dollars and cents, but it's where we think about how do these dollars and cents meet the actual goals and objectives that I have, right? Because I have $100 and you have $100. That doesn't mean we're going to spend it in the same way just because we both got $100. And it doesn't mean that because I spend it this way and you spend it another way, that $100 didn't lead to a positive outcome for us, right? My $100 might go to pay my car off. Your $100 might buy groceries. Somebody else, my $100 might buy a new suit for a new interview. Like, all of these $100 are being allocated according to everyone's budget based on their needs and their actual goals and objectives. So thinking about management that really adhere to thinking about this African-American immersive experience is important. 3 was relationships. Woo! I always say, when you're talking about leadership, cultivating relationships with people is the most important thing. Young people might be watching this, so I'm not going to say what I normally say, but really, if folks don't mess with you, how you going to lead them? Like, that's not going to work. On the other side, if people are following somebody, they mess with somebody in some sense, right? There is some relationship there. Now, we can go into the whole thing about power in relationships, because there is a thing that's about the relationship that I have is that's a boss and I'm the subordinate and this is where my paycheck is. But there is a healthy relationship that actually can talk about two individuals who are supporting each other's mutual growth. Right? And what does that look like to build those relationships that allows mutual growth to be real in your experiences in the classroom, in the school building, and in the community? So relationship building. 4 was expectations. Having high expectations, not just for students, but for staff also, including parents and communities, right? High expectations of what does it mean to be dope? What does it mean to be successful, to get the education that you're supposed to get out of here? And then lastly was perceptions of change. So being able to think about change in increments and being able to celebrate change. Now, these things that they highlight here are true for leadership. You can find a lot of leadership journals and leadership books that would say the same things, but we just want to highlight that thinking about the principle on page 41 really goes into the idea of the principle as a force of stability, something that's powerful, but also reaffirms the fact that this is a stable thing, that we are going to do this. I'm here for the long haul, and how important that was. And then the chapters move on to talk about teachers and what teachers needed to really be effective, but how challenging it was, right? A lot more stories about the middle school come out here, but teachers need to have commitment. At the end of the day, without that commitment, it wasn't going to work, right? And I've even found in my work with teachers, like getting into commitment is where you find the most effective sort of change or ability to think critically about their work when you talk about where their commitment lies and what they're committed to. It's true in any sort of leadership space, but thinking especially about what does that mean for teachers? What are the commitments that are keeping us there? What are the commitments that are grounding sort of our conversations in terms of thinking about this school and aligning with the vision, right? And then 2 was knowledge of history and culture. You had folks in the building who had so many resources and experiences around African-American history, literature, and the arts, and were willing to kind of use that to increase their capacity to learn in that space or learn with the young people. And so if you're already committed, your commitment to gaining knowledge is also going to be there, right? And there's a lot to say to think the difference between the origins of the school in 2019 about the role of the district. You have Act 10. You have all of these things that have kind of like switched the relationship teachers have to their own professional development and growth. Along with that is the widening discipline net. Like if we just think about what it meant to get in trouble in school in 1992 and what it meant to get in trouble in school in 2012, these are two different things, right? No different than you talk about the airport post 9/11 is talking about schools post Columbine, right? And what does it look like? You know, there was one conversation about gun control and all of that, but there's this whole other conversation of schools safety and zero tolerance, and then police in schools, which is a whole nother conversation that we can get into, but that comes up here. And so that knowledge of history and culture was embedded in their experience and also helped them to be successful in the school building. But the commitment really allowed that to be true. And just thinking about the amount of persistence that the community members, right, which is really important too, that at this point for this school to get to where it was, there was a community investment with a school leadership investment, with the educator investment, with a parent investment, right? And so how important it was to really, really get in contact with folks who had that experience. So I really appreciate you taking time to listen out for our recap for this week's book study. We'll look forward to our next set of chapters as we meet 2 weeks from today. I do have a mini homework assignment. One, I would love for you to comment on this video with a link to a news story relating to either one of these two schools, just so you can have an opportunity to think about what was happening, what was the media saying. This is pre-social media, right? So it's really what was the newspaper saying about either one of these schools, what was being reported on, and what could you find. So Google, look at the news sites and see what was written around this time. So you think late 80s, early 90s about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Thanks so much for being a part of Ubuntu's book study. We look forward to talking to you soon.